So hi everyone and welcome. This is AR Future Projects Live. I'm Manon Mola, one of the editors of the Architectural Review. I'm here with Ellen Pearson, also from the AR. And I'm delighted that we've gathered you all here today for this conversation. The AR Future Projects Awards were launched in 2002 and they're a window into tomorrow's cities. So they span 11 categories and they celebrate excellence in projects still on the drawing board or currently under construction, and the potential for positive contribution to communities, neighbourhoods and urban landscapes around the world. This year's judging panel brought together Christopher Hawthorne, who's Chief Design Officer for the City of Los Angeles, Catherine Slesse, architectural writer, critic and current president of the 20th Century Society, and Alpa Depani, who's newly appointed Head of Strategic Planning and Design for the London Borough of Waltham Forest, and who also contributed a great essay in the AR Future Projects catalogue. So all the entries were reviewed anonymously by our judging panel, who picked one winner per category before deciding on an overall winner. And since there were several projects that the judges felt were particularly strong, they additionally picked a highly commended and a commended entry. And the overall winner is the Master Plan and Regeneration Project for Laksevåg, or LAX project, to avoid kind of butchering the Norwegian words. And it's a former shipbuilding site in the Norwegian city of Bergen. And it's a proposal that was put together by London-based practices, Haptic Architects, Gort Scott, Morris+Company, and Turner Works, who worked in collaboration with Norwegian practice Vill and with engineering practices Elliott and urban systems design. So I'm very pleased that we've gathered representatives from all of these practices here today, and congratulations to all of you on what seems like a colossal effort and a great example of collaboration in architecture. And before I hand the virtual stage over to the winners, I would just like to add that all of this year's entries are published in the AR Future Projects catalogue, which came back from the printers just last week, and Ellen has her copy to hand.
Here it is.
With the winning project on the cover. So you can visit architectural-review.com/shop if you'd like to order a copy. There are also back issues of the AR that are available, and all orders from the shop help support the editorial work that we do. And for all the winners here in the room, copies are on their way or will be on their way to you shortly if they haven't arrived yet. So today we're very happy to be continuing the conversation outside and beyond the judging session and the printed pages. And so we'll start with a presentation of the Bergen waterfront regeneration proposal by Agnieszka and Scott from Haptic Architects and Jay from Gort Scott. So they will share with us the stories and ideas behind this project. And then together we will talk about the potential of waterfront sites as public spaces and about the team's take on how to repair, reuse and rehabilitate existing sites and structures to hopefully help inspire other projects of adaptive reuse around the world. Please do ask us questions using the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and someone from the large panel will do its best to respond. For now, over to you, Agnieszka, Scott and Jay.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Manon. So I'm going to start.
Just share my screen a second.
Perfect, yes, thank you.
Can you do that, Agnieszka?
Cool, I can see that, yeah.
That's
great. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for coming to listen about the LAX project in Bergen. Thank you for the introduction, Manon. So as Manon was saying, I think this is a really collaborative project. So this is I think I'm going to start by saying, this is a real example of very intense collaboration, as you mentioned, between Haptic, Gort Scott, Morris+Company and Turner Works. These are all architecture practices that are part of a collective called London. Elliott and Urban Systems Design were providing the engineering support for the project, but were also a very integral part of the team at every stage. Vill were the local partners. They're urbanists that gave the team great insight into current planning conditions in the city, which was invaluable and on-the-ground knowledge. So the competition was done at the height of the pandemic with the lockdowns in both London and Oslo, and therefore was purely a digital design process. The team made extensive use of new design tools, such as concept board and the Zoom sketch function. the COVID context is important for this project. Although in lockdown, the vaccines were rolling out and we were obviously looking to see the light at the end of the tunnel, this new post-pandemic social moment was on the horizon, and it highlighted the importance of quick meanwhile interventions for the scheme. Many of the team behind the LAX project are here, and you'll hear from them during the Q&A, and you can ask them questions, get a bit more insight. But just now, I'd really like to expand just for a minute about the collective that is London On. So London On was formed by 5 London practices as a counterpoint to Brexit, a way to reach out to other cities, to build bridges to other creative communities around the world, and to ask, how can we learn from other cities and how can we make our own cities better? As a collective, London On has visited several case study cities, taken part in the Oslo Triennale in 2019, and also hosted and organised a 13-hour marathon round-the-world dialogue. This was a blend of virtual and in-person discussions between London and other global cities. Do you want to just move to the slide that shows us all? Yeah, that's us. It was a bit of a challenge, but it was brilliant, and it was a real collaborative process, and you know, everyone pulled their weight. It was brilliant. So London On have entered several collective projects, both in the UK and internationally. As we know, open design competitions are by their very nature really time consuming with a low probability of success. So working together as a collective, this burden for each practice is shared and so reduced. But not only that, but a complex and extensive project such as LAX in Bergen, this actually becomes a huge advantage because you have different voices and approaches, and these result in a rich and diverse proposal, exactly how a good piece of city should be. So I am very pleased now to hand over to Jay and Scott, who will speak in more detail about the LAX project itself. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Agnieszka. So hi, I'm Jay Gort from Gort Scott. So from London, where I currently am at the moment, we sort of moved quite far north to the west coast of Norway, to Bergen, which is where the yellow dot is here, and that's the site of our award-winning project, the master plan at Laksevåg. So Bergen here, our site is actually here in the yellow, and Bergen is on the south area of Bergen, quite a fantastic city, which was formed of it's got 270 inhabitants of 270,000, and it sits in this valley between 2 mountains, either side, north and south. And underneath, it's a topography which is quite an amazing rift between land and water, and a series of cuts that were formed by glaciers many, many years ago. It's actually one of these cuts to the north of the city here. You can see, if you can see my pointer highlighting it, which is where the original harbour for the town was, for original harbour Bergen, and was formed in 1071, so a long time ago. And it actually, from there, we built up this series of this quite interesting, dense urban grain that is around there, called the Bergen area. Since then, the area sort of developed from that point to the surrounding to this entire urban area you can see today here now. Our site to the south, the Laksevåg area, has always been something of a hinterland, a sort of in a way a counterpoint to the main part of Bergen itself. And as you see it here evolving, was never always had a slightly, very much on the fringe. In fact, it wasn't until 1955 that actually a bridge was created that linked these two parts of the city together. And this quite heroic piece of engineering is quite important to some of the proposals we'll see as Scott will move through in more detail. So just looking at this is our site then, and here is the bridge on the left-hand side. And you can see how the bridge actually lands at this point of the layer of Laksevåg. Now, actually, that's about 4 or 5 stories above this waterfront, as you can see below. There's quite a big drop. And that creates a series of problems for our site in terms of severance and the connection to the public realm and connectivity up to it as well. But nonetheless, it's quite an amazing sort of place of different uses on this site. The site actually spans, the site for our project spans between the blue building here on the left over to the whole front and its new building over on the right-hand side here. And within there is home to a myriad of different uses. So for example, in this blue building here, we have a bakery, which is famous throughout Bergen and serves to all the cafes and restaurants. We have a sort of a drug rehabilitation centre just behind that, which has been kicked around different parts of the city in time and is actually very much sort of stigmatised, very important part of the city. In these buildings here with the drum draped roofs, we have quite an interesting industry which tests and works with nautical ropes and chains. There's then a collection of sort of small boat building and maintenance industries just around the slipway here. And there's a small pub and the white building. And then this collection of buildings over here towards the right of the site is home to a sort of a range of different uses of affordable workspaces. Actually, some of them sort of more expensive workspaces as well, been built more recently. But it's like a place for startups, incubator units. There's artists there, architects, tech startups. But it's also really importantly home to a lot of music practice rooms as well. Now, music is one of those places which Bergen is famous for. It's seen as sort of the music capital centre of Norway in many ways, sort of like the Manchester of the UK. Well, I would say that being from Manchester originally, I guess. But it's you know, it's important for the story and the ethos of what we're going to propose and talk about today. So we find all of this incredibly rich. When we started looking at the design for our site, so down on the right here on the south and LAX Laksevåg, we first of all did a really thorough analysis of what's the rest of the proposed developments happening on and the future of Bergen itself. We found that actually since 2010, there's been a quite ambitious project to work on the old dock area, and it's called Docken. And this is a place where there's an extension of the University of Bergen onto this area. There's actually even a new aquarium, national aquarium. There's a series of cafes, homes, and new public spaces, all enjoying the south light, and there's expansion to this, to the city of Bergen. You can see in here, we've got this colourful jamboree of different types of building jostling along one another, of different sort of architectural styles, and you know, I'm sure it's going to be a really interesting thing when it's development, when it's all completed. But we felt that actually the opportunity with our site can be something of a counterpoint to this in a way. We were never going to be able to just extend this same kind of flavour, this kind of like styling and that kind of, it's common in many other redevelopments of Scandinavian towns, because actually a lot of our spaces are shaded from the lights, from the hill behind us there. And also we really felt that is there not something about using some of the existing fabric that's there currently to create something that's truly distinctive and very much part of the town. So we set ourselves the question early on of what would happen if we reused everything that was there. And we started off looking and asking that question to try and use as much as we can. And that would be for three reasons, really. First of all, in terms of sustainability, we certainly didn't want to be demolishing all these things and all the carbon within that and creating new as well. We'd also think about how this landscape, this current landscape, has a series of really important uses for the town, and sits itself as a real working edge to the town, and also just in terms of character as well. I don't believe that you can really rebuild and create some of this character again. So we started the exploration through exploring all of the different structures and buildings on the site. Elliott Wood did a brilliant job. Mark's here today with us as well. Did a brilliant job of analysing each one of these structures, looking at whether they were wrought iron, they were steel, some were timber, some were concrete frame in this piece, and really analysing what we could actually add on top of these buildings, how we could, and what we might need, what we might need to change to allow for the brief, which actually did call for a very commercially viable scheme it needed to call for, so which doubled the amount of accommodation on the site, which would also introduce new residential, which is sort of a, you know, of a quality and aspiration that would start to pay for some of the public realm improvements, which were much needed on the site as well. Some of the buildings here in pink were actually buildings that, on observation, were actually going to be very difficult to work with in some ways. So we did actually surgically almost remove those pieces to allow and open up for the wider district, but the majority of work of the stuff was retained. And this allowed us to create what we ended up with. We created sort of series of spaces, which really, as I said, you couldn't design from scratch in a way. This is just one of many views that Scott will walk us through in a moment, where you get this juxtaposition, this collision of different forms in terms of, you know, existing buildings here with their idiosyncratic entrances and old industrial uses that now have been reappropriated. On the right hand side and beyond here, new uses as well that form together. And I think it just creates a sort of you know, it's not romantic or picturesque. It just has this very much a part of the accidental city that we really sort of love, and will create that unique, distinctive character we felt. So how do we get there? So we start off in the first phase by thinking about how we might seed some Miwal structures, which will start to give a sense of activity onto site, and that's something Scott will talk about in a moment. We then start to think about how can we nurture and find some of the existing uses that are currently there. So the existing music scene, a lot of the practice rooms are currently in this building, where it's just home to sort of some heavy metal band practice rooms and what have you. And it's about working with those, but then placing them in an area where they actually have a more public interface as well. And so they've become part of these old boat building yards. There's an opportunity which are actually sort of the uses of those go elsewhere, and we'll see in a moment. And that starts to engage a sort of new relation to this part of the town onto the waterfront. We then think about making the deeper wider connections, so across underneath the bridge here, which Scott will talk about in a moment, and then really trying to enhance this east-west connection, which we sort of call the high street in a way, which is where a lot of these buildings will work onto. And we start to intensify by adding new residential buildings, both on the individual plots themselves, but over and onto existing buildings, and all the uses start to get transformed around. We then enhance the waterfront by actually working in a sustainable way, by increasing the decking there to come out a little bit further to get some of the south lights, to allow some of these uses to start to spill out onto that, and then create new areas where there's actually maker spaces and industry beneath sort of residential or workspace as well at that point. A new mixed-use neighbourhood quarter is created over to intensify and really make this area work much harder. The area that currently has all those workspaces at the moment. And we've got quite a dense series of alleyways and network of spaces, which are quite unique because you're working with those existing structures in this first place. Then we make this sort of tram-link bridge that comes over in the future, a future piece, and all the connections have sort of become sort of complete. This slide then just shows a summary of the existing structures, which are shown in the blue. So these are all existing structures retained. Then we have the pale yellow are showing existing structures which have got then interventions added onto them. And then the yellow are actually some new buildings which work really hard to satisfy some of the economic requirements for the site. And think about the landscape becoming a really important layer, how this connects between the mountain down to the waterfront itself. And then once you then start to add all those layers together, you can see how it makes all these new connections, both by boat, by car, by bike, and by foot. It's a really permeable, truly connected piece of city that really feels distinct in itself. So say all of those pieces come together to create what we think is something that, you know, when this all does eventually happen, and I'm sure it will never quite be exactly like this, but it has an open-endedness to it. There's sort of it's always continuously being a question about what this part can be. So Scott, would you like to pull on from there?
Yes, thank you, Jay. Yeah, so as you can see in this drawing here, the end of that kind of phasing, the kind of vision of the place. What we really tried to get here is, you know, doubling that capacity of buildings that the brief called for, bringing in enhanced public realm that they also desired, but also, as we did that, not trying to brush away or sanitize this area, which actually what its strength is that it is this slightly hodgepodge, quite cheap area in relation to the kind of urban core of Bergen itself, because it's being that kind of slightly rough and ready other area that gives it a lot of qualities, actually. So as Jay was saying, it allows things like creativity and music to take place. It allows things like the restoration of ships to take place because it is economically accessible to lower yield areas of industry. So the other question that the brief really sort of posed to us was, how could we allow for all this development? How could we intensify public activity here, which is very little today, without losing that shipyard character and nature? And to not overly simplify it, our kind of solution to that was, well, could it still be a shipyard? You know, Bergen is a city, like many Western European cities, that is kind of defines itself by its shipping and shipbuilding history. So to lose that, as other cities have, Jay, you mentioned, you know, Manchester in the northwest, Glasgow would be another one, Genoa. When you lose that shipbuilding culture, there is a real sense of loss across the whole city. So the reason the shipbuilding is coming away from this area is those little buildings you see at the forefront near the water's edge. They're kind of obsolete for modern day shipbuilding and production. They're too small, they're too overly kind of complicated with structure. So our idea was then we could move the shipbuilding, the production facilities, to that kind of larger areas of land at the back of the site, which are currently not really utilized for anything. And in doing so, we could then keep the old shipbuilding sheds, and they could accommodate other functions. So Jay, if you could maybe change the slide. Yeah, so coming into the site plan, you can see here the consequences that by actually keeping as much as possible, we also keep the existing street pattern, which again is slightly irregular. It leaves for these very kind of as found spaces between buildings. And again, that's kind of keeping that character. So not trying to wash it away, not trying to sanitize it, keeping it for all its imperfections. Yeah. The other sort of key point here is increased connectivity to this site. So today it is kind of really disconnected from the city core to the north, with the exception of that higher level viaduct. As you can see, that completely passes our site. So in the future, with our kind of interventions here, you can see, for one thing, making that internal street, Damsgaard Vine, have a kind of bicycle lane and tooth into the bigger cycle network in Bergen. We're also proposing that by actually removing the industrial functions from a lot of the waterfront, it becomes accessible to people. And then, of course, the two new bridge links that come in at either side of the site. So we go from having an area which is almost completely disconnected to one that is actually one of the most toothed-in pieces of city in Bergen. And the next slide, please, Jay. So that increased connectivity, of course, gives us some opportunities to actually get new points of arrival into this neighborhood. So here, for example, you can see a new bridge link coming in below the existing viaduct. We can show that in a bit more detail in a minute. If you go to the next one, please. And then, as I mentioned, you know, bringing that quayside down to water level, opening it up to people rather than machines. Again, that can be another point of arrival for the site. And the next one. And also this area here, and you mentioned it already, Jay, this under the bridge area. Today, very kind of intimidating, maybe even off-putting for people to come into this district, but actually an opportunity to also frame a kind of gateway into what is hopefully going to be a new, lively and self-sustaining neighborhood. So on to the next one, please. Yeah, so here you can see the kind of the point where that bridge lands onto our side of the site. There's something really interesting about that medium level at the kind of 15-meter mark. That's the same level on the other side on Bergen, which is actually one of the most interesting neighborhoods. It's the kind of university district. So we saw an opportunity to actually create a medium level below the viaduct and actually bring in that really lively young student neighborhood with this area of the city, which today is completely disconnected. And next slide, please. And this is kind of what that gives us. It gives us this kind of arrival point from two directions, both on the road on our side, but also underneath the bridge. And one thing we should have probably mentioned for an outside audience is Bergen, being on the west coast of Norway, is extremely wet. It rains, you know, almost every second day. So having the opportunity to have an outdoor space that is actually covered above by this huge concrete viaduct is a great opportunity. As mentioned, we were also doing this in the kind of pandemic or towards the end of the pandemic period. So there was this kind of vision on the horizon of opening up again. So actually having this kind of well-ventilated, covered, but ultimately outdoor space for social occasion was actually something really interesting for us to do. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here you can see the kind of ground floor of that kind of event space below the bridge. And today it's kind of a mixture of kind of industrial kind of waste and kind of uneven ground. So a fairly low-tech intervention of giving a flat floor and managing the level change with a little amphitheater kind of stepping completely transforms the character underneath that bridge from being one of quite intimidating to hopefully something that's very inviting to the broader neighbourhood. Next slide, please. And here's that bridge that we talked about, the one that brings us in at that medium level. So this was done in close conjunction with Mark at Elliott to kind of propose a structural solution here to bring in that bridge. Now that was part of the brief, but with our sustainability kind of agenda that we all signed up to at the beginning of this competition, we saw that to build a new bridge is quite an energy intensive thing to do. So was there a way that this bridge could borrow from the kind of embodied energy of the concrete viaduct and we could hang it below? Yeah. Next slide, please. And then you can see that point where the bridge comes in and we have this flexible kind of curtained space below. So it can be, you know, informal kind of events, a meeting point in the city, or if you see into our next slide here. Yeah, obviously coming from a London On team, you'll remember sort of underneath the bridges on the South Bank, it becomes this kind of covered book selling market. Again, it could become this on a weekend. And the next slide, please. And indeed, it could become a kind of performative space, a kind of event space. So outdoor cinema, music, concerts, these kind of things. Yeah, next slide, please, Jane. So that was the kind of first area that we looked in. And as you can see, it's quite a low-key intervention. Our kind of plan for that was it could be done almost immediately on winning the competition to start that kind of socialization of the area. But moving on to the next area that the brief asked us to look for. And again, it was part of the sort of infrastructure that had been left behind in the center of the scheme there. This slipway, which is being used for kind of maintaining ships. As we've already mentioned, it's no longer going to be used for the maintaining of ships, but we did want to keep it as a kind of a connection between the water and the land, so that those buildings at the back still had that access to the water that would allow for them to be a productive space connected to the sea. Next slide. So this central area organized around the slipway, it's already where we were imagining these former sheds could be kind of appropriated into music-based activities, so concert hall, practice rooms. And then the thing that comes along with that, of course, is the kind of nightlife and social spaces. So on the other side of that slipway, those former sheds, which again are redundant to modern industrial standards, they can be reappropriated as food halls, restaurants, bars, these kind of things. You can also just see at the back of the site here, these kind of larger industrial buildings that on the lower level can take the kind of semi-heavy production spaces. And then as they get higher, more kind of modern production means even office work. It's maybe just worth a little comment at this stage to say that we did do this in the middle of the pandemic and it was a completely digital experience. So I don't know if for that reason there was a kind of reaction against hyper digital kind of presentation methods. So as you can see here, it was kind of beautifully hand drawn by actually Luke Matone, one of our colleagues at Morris+Company. And I guess there was just a kind of craving for this more kind of tactile response to all the digital meetings we were having. Yeah, if you go to the next slide, please. So again, this kind of key point in the site is really defined by trying to bridge those levels as well. So you can see the very high street at the top, and then how do you connect people down to the water below? So we also proposed a kind of ramp structure that could bring people down from the higher level. Yeah, next one, please. Yeah, And that's just a view of how that looks and how you have a clear vista down to that water. So always trying to pull people from the higher level down to something that they can see by the water's edge. The next one, please. Yeah, and when we kind of cut that away, you can kind of see, you know, those ground floors very active with public functions, and then kind of sitting tooth and gel with the kind of production spaces at the back of the site. And we kind of thought they're a bit of an odd mix, but actually they work really well together as programs because the industrial activity is happening during the day, and then it's not disturbing anyone trying to have a concert. And then when this place becomes more activated at night, of course, the production in the sheds has ceased for the day. Similarly, the same dichotomy between weekday and weekend. And these are those, that slipway area. So again, you can see how we're trying to use it as an industrial productive space, but then also can take in these social functions when that's not being used during the day. Next one, please. And the other thing to say about it is those new buildings at the back, they can take in a lot of car parking capacity. So that frees up a lot of these quayside spaces, which are actually bathed in a lot of sunshine, and they become almost instant public space and would be appropriated for all kinds of social activity. Next slide, please. And here's just another view to the side of that slipway. So these are the other former industrial sheds. And again, trying to imagine programs that would work here. So once this area becomes much more connected into the city, there was an idea from our colleagues at Turner Works that this becomes a very good place for kind of dark kitchens and a kind of food hall. So you could produce food here at a very low cost, and it could be distributed into the city centre once you have those bridge links coming into place. Next slide, please. And similarly here, once we've looked at some of these car parking structures, once we can get the cars away, so this is an elevated car park structure, sorry. They have the kind of load bearing capacity as the guys at Elliott would assess to take on even more building on top. So a car park can be transformed into, in this case, small artist atelier and workshop spaces. Next slide, please. And there's the kind of the complete constellation there, very different diverse types of production happening in and around this slipway area. So it goes from being a fairly derelict area that you find today into one that is activated by lots of different programs at different times of day. Next slide. And yes, working with, again, our colleagues at USD, you can see on the left, the kind of sun conditions that the site has today, really good in those central kind of social zones. And then the way we've kind of tailored the on-fill building capacity on the right, you know, even though we've doubled capacity on the site, we haven't actually diminished those sun conditions at all and allow for them to become these social spaces. And the next slide, please. Yes, and then just lastly, you can see those kind of the heights kind of high at the sides, and then as you get kind of closer to that kind of social civic core in the middle of the whole site, the heights kind of stepping down, giving us those good sun conditions. Similarly, we also wanted to be good neighbours in Bergen, so the people living on the hillside behind our site, their views back towards the city are uninterrupted by this heights coming in at the sides. And just to the next slide, please. Yeah, and here you can see that kind of in 3 dimensions, that kind of almost valley of heights that we proposed. And then just to the final image now. Yeah. So in summary, this is kind of the character and grain of what we wanted to propose. We hope that it still feels like a very kind of, has the kind of roughness of a shipyard, the kind of interest of it. It doesn't feel too polished, but at the same time, those spaces, particularly on the quaysides and water edge, are completely freed up for people rather than cars and ships and cranes that it has today. And yeah, that's us. Thank you.